Thank you. It's great to be here with you. So we've been hearing a little bit from a technological lens around what's driving the fourth industrial revolution, and that's really from a global lens, from where you're coming from the World Economic Forum. A lot of these technologies really relate to the big picture of what we've been looking at in the state of California and elsewhere around how this all folds up into governance. So what I'd actually like to talk with you about is to bring us from a global stage to the state level, to the state of California, and to think together about what might happen in the near-term future. The reason, well, I'll share a little bit of context just about Institute for the Future first. So we're based in Palo Alto, and we're an independent nonprofit research group. We just celebrated our 49th birthday, so we were founded in the year 1968, a very interesting year to be around and thinking about the future. I clearly was not there then, but since then we've been looking at a broad range of trends and disruptions in things like technology, as you would expect, but also health and healthcare, the future of education and governance, the future of philanthropy, and so on. Everything I'm about to say, I want to be clear, is not a prediction. We don't think that anyone can predict the future with a high degree of certainty. When you hear that certainty and you think, oh, I don't know about that, because actually the world is much more combinatorial and emergent than predictability. So to frame what I'm about to say, I just want to describe it as a set of forecasts, which are plausible, internally consistent, and intentionally provocative views of what might happen looking 10 years out. So in the year 2010, my colleagues joined together and tried to think together about the future of the state of California. And we had some thought partners in this, Citrus, CalIT2. And the context, just to set the scene, some of you remember this. So here's a New York Times article from that year, The Future of California, Ready for Discussion. So particularly if you were involved in politics, you probably remember this moment. It's easy to be discouraged about the future of California, what with the chronic political dysfunction, a depressed economy, deep social divisions, it goes on and on, $19 billion deficit, and so on. So this just needed to set the scene to take you back to the year 2010. And in that context, we really wanted to partner with some others to think about what the next decade might hold. We find that 10 years is really a sweet spot for future forecasting. It's far enough out that you can get beyond some of the polarities of the present that we find ourselves in so often, but it's not so far out that we can't grasp it. It doesn't quite seem like science fiction yet, even though it requires a stretch. So this is the time horizon where we decided we wanted to generate 4 different alternative futures for the state of California. And here I give a hat tip to one of the luminaries of futures thinking, Jim Dator. He's at the University of Hawaii's Center for Futures Studies. And we all should have gone to the University of Hawaii to study futures thinking. I don't know why I didn't. But he said, any useful statement about the future should at first appear ridiculous. And I just want to offer that to you as later, as you head back to your day jobs, to keep that in mind. It really has become a piece of wisdom in the foresight world, and I want to gift that to you all. So Jim was the one who generated an alternative futures scenario kind of framework. And I won't do too much of a methodological geek out, but just to say the high level, we think of this as a tool for systematically thinking about the future. The reason that you use it is because you want to use a wind tunnel for testing future strategies through different future conditions. That you want to be able to see not just what's possible, but what the preferred future is. So if you can define, what that whole kind of cone of possibility is, then you can slice through it and say, this is actually what we're seeking, that we think is the optimal for the most people. And then it also forces you to make your assumptions about the future explicit and to then, be forced to interrogate them and to challenge them. So I won't say much about this, but just the high level of these 4 scenarios, because there are assumptions baked into each of these. The first is growth, where you assume that trends and conditions that you see today basically continue forward. So you take what you can observe today and extrapolate that. There's collapse, so I'll go down to the lower left. Major social systems and infrastructure break down or fail, and there are usually a plausible scenario or two to be had about collapse. And I'll just pause here and say that growth is the default assumption that most organizations and governments around the world use when they're thinking about the future. Collapse is the next easiest for people to wrap their minds around. It feels sort of catastrophic. We have lots of tools in our culture for telling stories about, in our cultures for telling stories about collapse. So these two on the left tend to be the easiest to grok. Constraint, as kind of an archetypal way of thinking about the future, this is when, in instances when a core guiding value or purpose organizes society, organizes our systems. So you could think, for instance, in the past, you could think of China's one-child policy as an example, where there was a social contract. People all ended up in this system where it was optimized around one particular shared value that they ended up abiding by. And then transformation. So this is perhaps the hardest for most of us to think in terms of. This is when society or systems fundamentally change or reorganize. And I won't go through the bullets under here, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples so you could kind of peruse it yourself and see the assumption sets that are underneath each of these. So we used this methodological framework and asked, well, what might the next 10, this was in 2010, remember, what might the next 10 years hold for the future of California? And here I want to go actually transition to sharing a quick video. This is about 1.5 minutes, and it gives you a rapid fire tour of those 4 alternatives. While he's looking, I'll just say that some of these scenarios may feel a bit like shadow scenarios to you. And we find that sometimes the most useful forecasts are the ones that you absolutely don't want to see happen because they really galvanize a response to do something, to make a better or different decision in the present. So with that, the video.
Meet Lisa Garcia, a third-generation Californian in 2020. But there's not just one Lisa, there are 4. And she's facing different challenges and coming up with different responses depending on which future California takes. In a California of growth, Lisa has an idea to sell smart data for buildings, and she's just about to hit the big time. Money, entrepreneurship, these are the only ways to make it out west. In the collapsed future, California after the big one is divided between walled enclaves and everyone else, and life isn't sustainable for anyone, either inside or out. Lisa has to decide, move into the enclave or stay outside with her family. In a California of constraint, Lisa needs to make a big decision. Move to Texas, where taxes are low and jobs in her field are available, but the value's on her own, or stay in California and sacrifice some personal wealth to contribute to a more resilient state for all. Finally, in a transformation California, Lisa is making gains out of everyday life. Rewards, badges, and reputation points have become almost more important than money, making California a more engaging place to live. 4 stories of Lisa in 4 future Californias. Check back soon and we'll go deeper into Lisa's life in each of the 4 scenarios. So what are your challenges and your solutions in future California?
Thank you. So that just gives a rapid fire tour of these 4 visions of the future. And I'll just mention I have a limited, these are from 2010, so you know you have barely a few still in print, right? So I have a few of these in case anyone's interested in going a lot deeper. But just to remind us of the high level of these, so you can kind of stick a thumbnail sketch in your mind of each of them. I should say, the caveat, always, with alternative future scenarios, is that you'll find that elements of these alternative futures can and do play out simultaneously. So particularly in a state as big and as diverse in many ways as California is, know that we're not forecasting any one of these scenarios is the dominant future. We anticipate patchiness of where they'll play out in different parts at the same time. So a reminder of the smart state. This is, of course, the growth scenario. And here we're assuming a lot of smart systems that support innovation across a whole bunch of different sectors. Things like ubiquitous online learning, which in 2010 felt like, okay, what, maybe? To city, or smart systems in city governance, new models for aerospace, biomedical, alt energy industries. And we note that the rewards of growth are not equally distributed, however, in this kind of future. The rich and young thrive, poor Gen Xers have the hardest path. And you can see here how some of it plays out in some of those other assumption sets. So growth, when you think growth, think smart state. collapse. This is the one that haunts me personally. This is the story of the enclave economy. So here we imagine that the big one, the big earthquake happens, or some other, we assume some other catastrophic event happens in the state of California, and everyone has to figure out how to recover. So there is a highly privatized society in this scenario that loses some of the social cohesion that we may have seen in 2010 when we were forecasting this. Wealth is concentrated in a few highly connected urban areas that lock in basic resources from their periphery. So you get the idea here. Not the most cheerful of scenarios. We can probably all point to where we might see it here. Culture commons, this is when we really have to grapple with our resources, our resource constraints in the state of California. And so you can see here the rise of the green labor economy, integrated food sheds and urban planning, perhaps the rise of rights for non-human citizens we were forecasting in 2010. And last, transformation, 21st century superstructures. And this is assuming that a new kind of citizenship emerges as people build parallel institutions that leverage social media and other amplified technologies for their core backbone. So in this case, communities are not all geographically defined, and they replace some of our sectors that we know today as kind of the organizational ground, the organizational substrate for all of our other activities. So when we try to think about the future, we decided we needed to engage the public in imagining this together, and so we actually held a contest back in 2010. This was the top of the website up here, which you can still go to today and dig through the entries. We asked, what is your dream for California? We were California dreaming together. And these pictures, it's a little dark, but you can see that Mike Minadeo received the grand prize. He created what he called a beanstalk. And this was a carbon scrubbing device that recycled CO2 from the air and converted it into oxygen. So something that you could presumably have in your yard, for instance. So the question, why consider alternative scenarios? Well, I'll just close by saying that I think alternative scenarios are one of our best bets for activating our public imagination. We live in a world of private imaginations. You know, each of us has a notion of how we think things are going to play out. But what we really lack is a way of thinking together about, collectively, about what might be possible. And imagination is the engine of change and progress, and California has been known for that and needs to be known for that. If you can imagine something, you can make it real. So imagination is not a frivolous activity. It is the prior requirement for everything else. And so at IFTF, we call for the creation of a platform, multiple platforms, to stimulate and facilitate public imagination about the future. So I just want to leave you with that term, public imagination, because I think that's, at least indirectly, part of the role that you all will play. Thank you.